In case you hadn't guessed yet, consider myself to be a part of the Pokemon community. I find it to be one of the best, and it has so much material to cover, so I thought it would be a good discussion point for the channel, not to mention the recent release of Pokemon Legends Arceus definitely helping me bring in views on Pokemon content. However, if there was one group that I would place as directly responsible for my full force return to the Pokemon community, it would be the Fuji's Lab Discord server. While I never really fell out with the Pokemon franchise, I did lose much of my interest for a few years because of increasingly worsening releases and the simple fact that my attention was being drawn to more important real-life matters. One YouTuber who I have followed quite closely for a decent amount of time now is Birdkeeper Toby, a pretty popular Poketuber who has been active on the platform for quite a few years now. He has always been popular for his theories, which also remain some of his best videos in my humble opinion. So, in the latter half of 2020, he chose to create a Discord server with several other big Pokemon theorists where the whole community could focus entirely on creating theories. I first stumbled upon it on accident in the form of a YouTube community post and thought it sounded interesting, so I promptly joined in the discussion. Over the past year, I've held a lot of conversations with the wonderful people of the Fuji's Lab server, but I've found that new information could help contribute to some of our older and perhaps more outdated theories. Hello y'all, I'm Afton Geek here, and this is Afton Talks, where today we're looking at how exactly Spiritomb can have a gender. That was a long intro, so I'll do my best to keep this part short. I'm definitely planning on turning this into a full series, so if you want to hear more Pokemon theories concocted by this wonderful community and reevaluated by yours truly, feel free to subscribe in order to ensure you never miss an upload. Also, if any of this sounds fun to you, then I recommend that you go check out the Fuji's Lab Discord server for yourself. I'll be putting a link to it down in the description, and I highly recommend that you go interact with the wonderful people who post their theories there. Alright, shilling done, on to the video. For my first episode on this topic, I decided to go way back in the server's history to the very first theory that I actively played a role in helping develop. On September 1st of 2020, the community was abuzz discussing what exactly a ghost Pokemon is, which is a whole other can of worms I won't be getting into here, when Fruit319, a prominent member of the server who is still very active to this day, mentioned to Inkmaster, another very active and notable inkwell around the Fuji's Lab Discord server, that Spiritomb can breed. This realization was quickly followed by another. Not only can Spiritomb breed, but Spiritomb also has a gender. While this may not seem odd to an individual who is not familiar with the Pokemon franchise, any who pay close attention to the Pokedex will see why this may be peculiar. As Spiritomb's Pokedex entry in Heart Gold and Soul Silver states, Spiritomb was formed by uniting 108 spirits. It has been bound to the odd keystone to keep it from doing any mischief. This is not a one-off note either, making appearances in the entries in Pokemon Diamond, X, Omega Ruby, Sword, Brilliant Diamond, and Legends, all relating back to one of its likely inspirations, the 108 demons, which would later become the Stars of Destiny in the Chinese classic Water Margin. Because this fact is so intrinsic to the lore of Spiritomb, it seems odd that Game Freak would choose to give Spiritomb a gender, especially given the presence of a large number of Pokemon which lack gender, and even some which are capable of breeding regardless of this fact. This led to Ink and Fruit determining two different ideas about how exactly Spiritomb could have gender. Inc. came up with the argument that, because the entries mostly stated being made from spirits, Spiritomb was an entirely new organism, simply remade from the spirits of the Wicked 108, with the act of binding it to the keystone somehow merging the spirits and forming something entirely distinct from the spirits before. Fruit, meanwhile, continued to assert that each of Spiritomb's spirits were distinct, though this kept the issue of how exactly 108 varied spirits could have gender. It was at this point that I stepped in with a new consideration. Perhaps the Spiritomb was, as Fruit had suggested, composed of distinct spirits, but the gender was determined by which group held the majority, such as a Spiritomb with 55 male spirits and 53 female ones being a male Spiritomb. There was more consideration about the specifics of the spell, but a solid conclusion was never really reached, so the debate remained as to whether Spiritomb was a unified entity born of 108 punished spirits, or the 108 spirits themselves trapped. In the time since this discussion, there has been some evidence to add to it. As a result, with this new information and a year's older mind, I think it's time to look back on this theory and determine which is really the case. The main reason I wanted to make this video is coming up, but first I want to mention a smaller piece of information. Exactly 9 days before this original conversation, the Crown Tundra DLC came to Pokemon Sword and Shield, bringing Spiritomb to that game. For some reason, likely because of how new the information was, we did not mention the entries added in this DLC for Spiritomb. Shield's entry gives very little new information, mostly just adding a little more to Spiritomb's origin, but Swords adds something really interesting. It reads, exactly 108 spirits gathered to create this Pokemon. Apparently there are some ill-natured spirits in the mix. Did you catch that? The use of are as the form of to be here definitely gives some credence to the idea that the spirits are distinct. The use of the verb gathered is also really interesting, as it doesn't imply any combination or merging, simply collecting together. Yet another point for distinct spirits. The greatest argument towards this case, however, comes from the newest Pokemon game, Pokemon Legends Arceus. Before I get into it, this is a spoiler warning for those who have not played the game or do not want to be spoiled on the specifics. For all others, we will continue forward. In PLA, there is a side quest the player is introduced to after defeating the first noble, which involves collecting up 107 different wisps into the odd keystone. As you may have guessed, the event ends when the player has collected all 107, at which point the young girl who gave you the mission, Vesa, implies that she is the 108th spirit, disappears, leaving behind only a wisp, and Spiritomb is formed. The first important thing to note is that this Spiritomb is not gender-locked, so even though we know there is at least one female spirit in the mix, that being Vesa, you can still get a male Spiritomb. The spirits are also heavily implied to be distinct in thought, as Vesa talks to the player after they gather the last spirit and the keystone disappears. While her final words seem to be very, well, final, it is an interesting note which gives some credence to the idea that the spirits are distinct, even as Spiritomb. It is for this reason that I think the best solution was something not entirely considered, but instead a combination of multiple other ideas. I believe that biologically, Spiritomb is almost certainly distinct from the 108 spirits which make it up. Having seen the wisps in Legends, it seems that Spiritomb is in some way different from them. For that reason, I believe Spiritomb's gender is determined by some unclear biological factor, which cannot be concluded based on the knowledge we currently have. However, I also believe that the spirits are distinct in thought, capable of acting on their own but are melded together in form. Now just to figure out how exactly Spiritomb can breed, given that it's made up of evil spirits and it would have to replicate more evil spirits. I've been Afton Geek here, and good night, y'all.